Welcome to Azure Mythbusters, and today's myth is, can I move Active Directory to the cloud? I'm April Edwards, and I'm here with
Justin Davis.
A lot of organizations we work with day to day use Active Directory on-premise. When they look to migrate to the cloud, they want to know how they can bring their authentication mechanism with them.
So looking at the slide that you've got here, Azure Active Directory is the largest IDaaS service in the world.
Correct.
How big is this?
This is massive. This is our control plane in the cloud. So Azure Active Directory is our Active Directory service that Microsoft offers in our cloud platform. So we do things like offer different tiers in it, so you have a free, basic, and premium tier. So if your organization on-premise wants maybe just some basic functionality, great. If you need more kind of compliance, auditing, et cetera, we have a premium tier and also offers more services for you. We have 14 plus billion authentications a week in our cloud. Wow. That's massive, right? And we have extensive capability in our cloud. So now that we've introduced what our kind of ID as a service looks like, let's look at reasons why you'd move to Azure AD. Okay, Justin? So first of all, one identity platform for all. So you're working on-premise today in a data center.
Yep.
How many different types of authentication do you have?
I mean, my dev teams could spin up their own authentication if they're writing applications. Obviously, you've got the central, logging into my desktop authentication. You've got legacy authentications as well. So I mean, I think there's going to be more than 10 probably, especially if you're talking about old school enterprises, right?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of line of business apps, some legacy apps, et cetera, and custom built stuff. So we need to look at how we move that in our on-premise environment into the cloud. So things also enabling security. So how secure are these apps that you guys are custom building? Exactly. We don't really want to know, right? So maybe we want to enable things like single sign-on or multi-factor authentication. This is a massive reason why we want to start using Azure AD. So let's look at the control plane that is Azure Active Directory, okay? What we want to do is enable mobility across the cloud and even multiple clouds. So what does Azure AD do? So it takes your on-premise Windows Server Active Directory environment, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
I'm more of an open source guy, but let's just go with this.
So when you log into that machine, you have that username and password
Yep.
into maybe your network PC and maybe to some of your servers and VMs, et cetera. So that will sit on-premise today, and then we look to authenticate that into our IDaaS platform. And that gives kind of a self-service portal, enables single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, and it gives you a simple connection into the cloud.
So Azure Active Directory isn't a replacement for what I have on premise, right? It's kind of, they work well together.
It's an extension.
Okay.
It's absolutely an extension. And it also allows you to plug into other cloud platforms. So if you're using Microsoft 365, Azure, Power BI, et cetera, these are the backplane of the Microsoft technologies, okay?
Yep.
So let's look at technologies that maybe aren't Microsoft related. So we have our on-premise AD environment, we replicate that into Azure AD, okay? Maybe we look at customers that want to bring their own devices. We manage AD and we have policies and different products to help manage that as well.
And so that can flow from Azure Active Directory down to the devices and help them to be able to log in on whatever device they're on.
Absolutely.
And any operating system as well?
Exactly. We have Linux, Mac OSs, Android devices, so you can manage mobile devices in your organizations, your laptops and PCs, and have that whole bring your own device, shadow IT conversation becomes a more managed conversation, if that makes sense.
Brilliant, yeah.
Right? Because everyone has multiple phones. Some organizations have one phone, a lot of companies have two phones because you have a work and a personal phone, right? So this is how we get around that. Azure AD also plugs into a lot of third-party services, and that's really important. So we have pictured here the cloud. Now the cloud's a big terminology for what exists today. So we have a lot of customers using things like SAP and Salesforce. Your Azure AD integrates into that. For those open source people, we have GitHub. Also our tools like Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio you can bring your AD credentials into as well.
Okay, so it's essentially literally allows you to be able to disseminate your one account across all of these applications, all of these devices as well.
Yes, and still have that security protocols in place and still managed centrally by your IT organization.
So your security guys and girls are really, really happy that it's just one single pane of glass to be able to look after all of this, I guess, heterogeneous ecosystem, I guess, if you want to talk about a buzzword,
It makes the management so much easier, right? And that's what we want to do. So if we're looking to consume in maybe another cloud or our own cloud, or deploy using things like Azure DevOps for our devs and for our operational teams, Azure AD sits behind all of this. I like to talk to customers and say it's the backplane of our authentication mechanism. It is behind every service we offer at Microsoft. It's available in our cloud and on-premise as well.
Okay, brilliant, okay.
Cool. So let's look at some of the services that we offer with Azure AD. Azure AD does a ton of great things. It does not replace your on-premise Active Directory environment at all. So that still needs to stay. Azure AD is really just a managed service that does have an SLA around it, but has added features. So if you want to look at remote access to your apps, maybe joining your devices, etc., this is a great thing to use. Now, you can manage your group policies as well in the cloud, and it's all kind of backed up there. You can get security reporting, which is really important. And then integrate into different apps like your HR apps or your Microsoft 365 applications. That's all there. We see a lot of customers looking at how do we enhance our security in our organizations. Multi-factor is the big one. So today, when you log into your Microsoft account, Justin, what happens?
So it asks me for my email address, and then it pops up and says, please sign in with your phone.
Yep.
I get a notification on my phone, put my fingerprint on it, and I log in. I don't have to use a password at all.
Absolutely.
It's weirdly efficient.
It's really efficient, it's cost effective for organizations, and it's more secure. So using your thumbprint or whatever fingerprint you choose, or you can even use a password as well,
Yes.
right? So it's really great. It's easier for our end users. It's also easier to manage from the IT perspective as well. So how do we replicate from our on-premise environment into the cloud? Now, I know you're more of an open source guy and you're managing applications, et cetera, but you have to think, how do I get all this stuff from here to there?
Yeah.
It's pretty simply, right? So we can do what's called a federated identity. So if you're looking to have everything replicate kind of back and forth and really emulate that on-premise identity, we look at a federation.
And that just constantly keeps it in sync, does it? From
Yes.
what's on-premise into the cloud. Does it work in the reverse as well? So do you modify stuff in the cloud in Azure Active Directory and then have it sync back, or is it just kind of a one-way traffic?
So you can do it two-way traffic.
Okay.
So let's say, for instance, you are running a data center for your organization, and it can be open source, it can be Windows machines, whatever it needs to be, and maybe you have one or two data centers, and you have a complete outage, okay? What do?
Scream?
Yep, cry, and hide, and then move on, right? So with Azure Active Directory, everything's synced to the cloud. Because it has an SLA behind it, if you were to lose one or two or more of your on-premise data centers, your identity will exist in the cloud. Okay, so that federation piece is really great. The other thing you can do is synchronize your identity. So some customers don't want the overhead of a federated identity or need a much simpler mechanism to authenticate to, okay? So maybe you're running a data center that is maybe just a single data center or two, you're not a massive shop, and you just want to synchronize everything up to have that peace of mind. You can still manage everything in the cloud, but it syncs one way. So maybe Azure AD is kind of your DR site for your AD environment,
Right, okay, yeah.
And maybe a tertiary backup, right?
Yep, makes sense.
So it's kind of that extra piece. Now we have a lot of customers, let's say you're running a startup, okay? Their entire identity could be in the cloud. You don't have to have any on-premise environment.
Right, okay, so you literally can have this as your identity service. You don't have to worry about anything on-premise. It's just spin it up, off I go.
Exactly. And this is great because if you don't want the overhead of an on-premise environment or you're a startup and you want that security package with it, you can run it entirely in the cloud.
So I work in the app space a lot. I do a lot of development. Usually when you're integrating with other services, you have to download a software development kit. Is that what you have to do with Azure Active Directory, or are there other ways to be able to integrate with it?
So the protocols are built in. So if you look at this slide here, it shows what kind of mechanisms or what kind of protocols you use on-premise today, things like NTLM, Kerberos, et cetera.
Yep.
In the cloud, it uses SAML, OAuth, and OpenID Connect.
These are like totally open protocols for me to, if I've done it with other integrations with other clouds or other back-end services, I'm just used to doing all of this, right?
Absolutely. So all these protocols will be built in.
Great.
So when you look at the hybrid model here, one thing to note is it syncs with password hashes.
Okay.
So it's a little bit different. And then when you have more of a hybrid environment, you could go with a full federation. You can go with or without those password hashes.
Okay.
So you get the option in the federated environment. So if you're already using protocols on site, maybe that federation might be the best fit for your organization, if that makes sense. Okay? So then let's kind of take a look at what does access really look like? How do we give access? How do we remove it? We can give individual user access, but it's best practice to give group access, okay? Right. So let's say, for instance, you're an organization and you get fired. We don't like you, you're gone.
What?
Yeah, you're gone, you're fired. What do we do? What do we do in an organization when someone leaves? If you have everything assigned to kind of user protocols and user assignments, that person leaves, you have to go track down every single place that you gave them access to that application or cloud services, even on-premise services. So very similar to on-prem, you want to put everyone in kind of user groups or security groups, okay? It's better to manage it. But you can allow sign-in, you can block sign-in, you can enforce MFA, you can allow access in from other applications, et cetera. You can get very granular in your control, and I think this is really important. It's not just a blanket access to everything, it's granularized control to your environments.
Gotcha. Okay.
All right? In your application that you brought up before, how do you handle this authentication? Talk me through it.
Well, so old school way, not thinking about identity as a service, you would have an authentication API, you would store usernames and passwords in a database, hash passwords, and then you would essentially have to write your own authentication mechanism, and then on top of that you have to then have the authorization mechanism as well. So what can that person access? And it sounds like everything that you're saying here is that Azure Active Directory and Active Directory itself kind of does a lot of that for me, right?
It does, but you're going to have external users accessing your application, right?
Yeah.
How do you manage that today?
With great difficulty. I mean, I've written numerous authentication and authorization APIs in my time, and it's literally the last thing that you think about. You want to write features. You don't want to be sitting there going through the operational side of things. So, yeah, it's one of those things that as a developer, you just don't want to have to deal with.
It's hard work.
Yeah.
It's really hard work, and you're not developing code, you're developing an operational side. So we have a bit of a solution for that. So Azure AD is great for inside your organization for internal users. A lot of organizations we work with are trying to give access to their applications to external users. Might be an application for like a gym or fitness app or something. How do we authenticate that in, right? So we have two different types of products called Azure B2B for business to business and B2C, business to consumer.
Okay.
So we can give external users access to your application. So let's start with B2C, because I really like your use case. Okay, so you've built this app, you're having to maintain it, you have a whole infrastructure behind it, you have people working on it. Now, what happens if people go to log into it and maybe they're bringing their own account? If they're coming from an external organization like a Gmail account or et cetera, what happens to you guys when Google it changes their protocols?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to, let's say, use Google, Facebook, kind of, as you said, Gmail, all of these things, you've got to keep up to date in terms of what changes with the API. And even if when you're adding in those social identities, you still have to do a bundle of development work just to be able to add that into your authentication mechanism. So I think you're going to give me some good news now, right?
I am going to give you good news.
There you go.
So I work with a lot of companies that say, right, we want to give access to our apps to our end users, right? Maybe we have a gym app or a fitness app and we want people to bring their own email address. So the advantage of that is they're not having to manage an account. With Active Directory, whether it be on-premise or in Azure AD, you have to manage an account and that user, and you have to pay for that account because Azure AD is per user pricing. So why pay and have the management overhead, right?
Sure.
So right now in your application, you have everything built on-prem, you have a database, you have an infrastructure, you have to back it up, you have to think about DR, patching the OS, security footprint, et cetera.
Yep.
That's all covered in Azure AD. The B2C service also allows you to bring your own identity to that service. And you grant access to your application or a very specific resource in your Azure environment or even on-premise, okay? So example, like if Google changes their authentication protocols, which has happened, and I've worked with customers that have built their own authentication systems and okay, now no one can log in.
Yeah.
And they're spending hours or days, and that's time. Time is money, right? So Azure AD automatically updates those protocols for you. So when your application updates or Google updates, that's all built into the platform.
And that's down to the Azure AD team to basically keep up to date and do that work that developers would have to do themselves, right? They know that there's an authentication change coming. We will make the change for you. Everyone's happy.
Yes, and it's fully supported.
Wow, okay.
And you can do custom kind of like login pages and all that good stuff as well. You can make it your own. So even though it's our service, you can do a custom login page. It's a great
So
feature.
you have no idea that it's running on Azure. You have no idea you're using Active Directory. It's just a nice login page.
Absolutely, and your users can bring their identity and you don't have to manage it and you still get the full security suite with it.
I'm actually at the moment writing an application which is doing authentication using another authentication provider because I just couldn't bring myself to write this. So I am definitely going to be investigating this after we get out.
Awesome, so here we go, B2C.
Thank you.
And the last one I'm going to talk about a little bit is B2B. So this is when you agree to federate with another organization. So let's say your organization is collaborating with another organization and you need full access across your environments. B2B is it. That's the path you would take. The difference in B2B is that you have to actually manage both overheads. So you need to be with a trusted single organization, or can be multiple organizations. It's kind of like a forest trust in the old days of Active Directory. And that's a little bit more overhead, but that might be required for your application and your environment, and that's absolutely fine. But that also integrates into SharePoint Online, the Microsoft 365 suite, et cetera. So you can work together and collaborate with another organization fully.
So organization one doesn't have to create a new account for somebody in organization two. They don't have to worry about essentially doubling up on the accounts that they have. The trust is done at the Active Directory level.
Yes.
Wow.
And if you want to collaborate, which is massive for devs and even operational teams, and when we start talking about processes like DevOps, et cetera, collaboration's key. So if you want to integrate into things like Microsoft Teams, Azure B2B is a great way to connect the two organizations and have a seamless integration across. So you have that kind of SharePoint backend, you have file storage, you can collaborate on your projects, and you can chat and do video conferencing calls. So B2B also helps integrate that through all the products as well.
And so this is the way that kind of some of my customers kind of give me access to their subscription. Sometimes they give me access in a joint Teams channel. This is basically what's happening in the background, is that actually my account is allowing me to log in to their tenant, essentially, right? In this Active Directory, which is doing that.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And if there's any kind of organization that has an acquisition and they need to kind of figure that out, B2B is really, really good use for that as well.
It allows you to be able to wrap it up really quickly.
Absolutely.
Lowers your operational impact as well.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you, Justin, for sharing experiences with your application issues today.
And thank you, April, for busting the myth that Active Directory can do all of these things and is very easy to be able to use. I think you're going to save a lot of developer time.
We'll see developers, operational teams, and exec teams go, great, this is how we take our first steps in the cloud. This is how we kind of make it all work together. So thank you very much for watching today, and we're going to include some resources at the end for you to kind of look at and reference as well.